Hi and welcome. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Luis Jaramillo, the director of the School of Writing here at the New School. For over 15 years, we at the New School have been honored to program events with Cave Canem. We rarely, though, get to have a chance to have two Cave Canem events in 2 weeks. Last week, Reginald Flood, Roxanne, Beth Johnson, and Amber Flora Thomas were here, and it was really quite a reading. But this event tonight was canceled in February because of the snow. Now we have a beautiful day. And we're so lucky to have Evie Shockley, Santee Frazier, and Camille Rankin here tonight. Camille will be moderating. Now I will pass the rest of the introductions over to Soretta Morgan, the Cave Canem Outreach and Development Fellow. Please welcome Soretta.
So, as Lee said, I am Soretta Morgan, Cave Canem's Outreach and Development Fellow. Thank you all for coming. As you may already know, Cave Canem is a national organization dedicated to cultivating artistic and professional growth for African American poets. Since 1996, Cave Canem has been building a home for Black poetry across the country. We have many amazing programs throughout the year, including an upcoming reading at New York City Poetry Festival on July 26th, and that's on Governor's Island. Please sign our mailing list. It's over on the table. And we'll keep you up to date on upcoming events. You can also learn more about Cave Canem and what we're up to and ways to support by visiting our website, www.cavecanempoets.org. I'd like to thank our host, the New School, Lori Lynn Turner, and her team for all of their hard work. Thanks also to our funders, the New York State Council on the Arts, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the Mrs. Giles Whiting Foundation. And of course, thanks to all of you, without whom there would be no audience with which we could share this amazing work. And I'm delighted to present you with Evie Shockley and Santee Frazier. Evie Shockley is the author of 2 books of poetry, The New Black, one of Library Journal's best books of 2011 in poetry, and A Half-Read Sea. She has also published a critical study, Renegade Poetics, Black Aesthetics, and Formal Invention in African American Poetry. Her poetry and critical essays have been published in The Nation, Cura, Tri-Quarterly Online, and elsewhere. Shockley is Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where she teaches African American literature and creative writing. A member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, Santee Frazier earned a BFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and an MFA from Syracuse University. His debut collection of poems, Dark 30, portrays Native Americans living on the fringes of contemporary America. Frazier's honors include a Lannan Residency Fellowship and a 2001 Truman Capote Scholarship from the Institute of American Indian Arts Creative Writing Program. Frazier is the 2014 Native Arts and Culture Foundation Literature Fellow. We'll hear from Evie and then Santee, followed by a conversation moderated by powerhouse poet Camille Rankin, whose chapbook, Slow Dance with Tripwire, received a 2010 New York Chapbook Fellowship from the Poetry Society of America. Her first full-length collection, Incorrect Merciful Impulses, is forthcoming from Copper Canyon Press. And now you'll have Evie. Enjoy.
How's everyone? Aren't you guys beautiful? I am going to read, let's see, well, I don't know. I have several things that I could read, and I'm going to choose from among them, depending on how much time I have. But I thought I would start with a poem that I wrote on the train, because I have been working, well, in part on a million things that have less to do with poetry than I would like. But also including a long poem, which I am not prepared to share. I feel like when I'm giving readings these days, I'm just reading the same poems over and over again. So for those of you who have heard me read recently, there might not be anything else new. So I thought I'd write a poem on the train. And the poem is called Poetry in a Hurry, a Defense. And, yeah, I thought it was going to go there too, but it took off in a different direction. Because sometimes the poem you need has not been written yet, and the right moment for reciting it is right now. You forgot who you love most, whose pain we have ignored this week, where bombs are laying babies down to sleep, where laws are bricking thick walls up, where lies are digging tunnels underground. That's how they get around. Which grassroots group of voting rights activists or union organizers or free speech advocates need a shout out or some cash? The minions of greed are always ready. Violence waits for nothing but seizes the day. So how can you put off your good word work right now? So, and from there we go to poems that someone in this room has heard before, but maybe not everyone. I'm going to read this elegy for Jane Cortez. Any Jane Cortez fans in the audience? Yes, okay. So, still trying to reconcile myself to her being gone. This poem tries to channel her through her rhythms and language and references that those of you who know her work will recognize. How long has this Jane been gone? Not long. Not long. In fact, she's back, flapping with the gale-force laughter of the first kites of March, growling like a motorcycle of liberation, howling like the angel of field hollers at the bleachers of poetic apathy, where they're always ready to make some noise, but never get in the game. Oh yes, she's back. Back like she was never gone, still blues washing over the whitewashing of the music, still pinning the tail on the covert donkey of domination, still hissing wisdom into the imperial bathwater, still cussing the fuck out of evil rapist punks and the friendly ones too. She's right up beneath your mama's left breast, right up in the cook-footed cornbread, still breaking out like sweat on the drummer's forehead, still chuckling in the backyard over her hot diaspora stew. Can't you hear her, rumbling like an earthquake through the crowded blocks of Watts, sizzling like the wind off the ancient coast of Ghana, honking like the traffic symphony in the hot sauce streets of New York, crashing onto the untamed sands of the people's beaches of Cuba? How long has this Jane, this breathtaking Jane Cortez, been gone? Not long. Not long. In fact, she's back. Yeah, back for seconds. A little more Armstrong funk in the sunshine. Another helping of that spicy Caesarean callaloo with a bit of red pepper poet mixed in. Another round of Big Mama Thornton blues brew, right, Bumblebee? Yeah, she's looking for a second slice of that wicked shit Guillen cooked up. Another bite of that African truth casserole Chano Pozo's serving from his conga. Very fine, very fine. One more taste of the scatology spittle, Ella still slinging around the Savoy ballroom. One more ride on the train, this side of time, before she takes it to her final destination. Have you seen her? Drinking the conjure woman's pot liquor straight out of the pot, sashaying across the evening sky like a bouquet of black girl smiles. Have you heard her, toxing in her gut bucket lullabies into the ears of desperate children, exhausted men, and outraged women, sweeping the dust of corporate-sponsored exploitation off the bandstand with her fire-spitting lyrical jazz cleanup crew? Have you felt her, rattling your bones with the daily news of the latest pro-democracy drone strike, licking with sandpaper cat tongue kisses the numbed shell of cultural desensitization to violence we call paying the bills? Have you seen her? Have you seen her? How long has our Jane been gone? Not long. Not long. She's no farther away than the sound of her name and her hellified poetry ringing out of our long-memoried throats. If we act right, she'll be right back. I never know where that's coming from. I'm going to read a poem, another new piece, newish piece that I think only one or two people in the room have heard. And this is called Philosophically Immune. Thinking about how we think we get knowledge, how we think about knowledge. Philosophically immune. Can I deduce the nature of humanity from the relationship of American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations to African women with HIV? Is it natural to test pharmaceuticals on people who are citizens of less powerful nations, members of a devalued gender, representatives of a maligned race? Is it logical? Is it cost-effective? Is the nature of the relationship of American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations to African women with HIV economic or human? Economic or humane? Are African women with HIV human? Are African women human? Are Africans human? Are American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations human? Are American corporations human? Are Americans human? Are American corporations citizens? Are Africans American? Are African Americans multinational? Can humans have a relationship to American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations? Are corporations corporeal? Are corporations real? Are corporations corpses? Are corporations gendered? Are women representative? Are humans incorporated? Are humans pharmaceutical? Is HIV pharmaceutical? Is nature pharmaceutical? Is nature humane? Is nature natural? Are nations natural? Are nations raced? Are nations corporations? Are nations cost-effective? Is nationality a test? Can I deduce the humanity of the listener from the relationship of the listener to American and multinational pharmaceutical corporations? Can I deduce the nature of the listener from the relationship of the listener to African women with HIV? Thank you. I think I have time for maybe just one more. So I'm going to read a sonnet from my book that I haven't read in a long time. It's called A Sonnet for Stanley Tookie Williams. Does anyone remember who he was? If you're thinking LA, the Crips, it maybe will come back to you. And this was a poem I wrote at a time when I was trying to deal with the fact of his execution by the state, and questions of justice and incarceration that arose around his situation. A sonnet for Stanley Tookie Williams, and the epigraph from Bob Marley. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption songs. All month this country has careened toward cold and winter's celebrations. What a star announced, a birth, and then a chance to fold a year away, pull one fresh from the drawer. If not clean, well, unworn. In just a few months arrives the ice-hot day of the dead come back to life. Time then to ask how new and re-beginnings differ. Mary bled for the December miracle, as someone must. Did you imagine sacrifice as you called the Crips to life? Did they come, those young bloods, at the crackling of your voice, like Lazarus to Christ? Vigilant night, on the road to San Quentin, candlelight. Thanks.
So as Evie was reading, I was watching people go by, and I was just thinking, like, don't they know that people are reading poetry in here, and they should be in here right now, taking it all in. But they don't know. They're going on about their everyday lives. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight, and what I've prepared for you tonight isn't sort of something I'm normally accustomed to doing. I'm just basically going to do a style sample of all the styles that I like to work in. Some of it would be very narrative, some of it language-driven, that kind of thing, but I think you'll kind of get the gist as I'm going through. A mix of old and new work also. Root juice. He walks out of the junkyard like an oar, the root juice in his clutches. No wrapper on that 2-liter, the undulating root gathering at the cap. This ancient thing in plastic, plucked from the dirt and given the means to heal. This tincture of the gully bend that ends gossip and calls down a flood. No hymn or myth tells how this root grows, a conjure pickled in a brine of spit and corn. He stops, slams the juice on the hood, loosens the cap, and tightens his mouth for a drink. Mama's work. Mama tucked the coffee can between her wrist and hip and walked down Dry Creek Road, her eyes lined up, blush and lipstick, her Levi shorts cut above the thigh. And what it was to see those farmers cutting down wheat, side-glancing Mama, barefoot and brown. Sometimes it's flour, sometimes it's money when she empties the can, her work in the quiet corners of barns on the hay, on hot days when locusts launch themselves out of thickets. I stare down Dry Creek Road, looking for her wrist and hip, her splayed hair and small toes walking out of a pone-colored dust. So just to continue with the sort of the mother figure that I sometimes obsess over in my work, I'll read one more of those. It's called The Carnival. I studied every ride on the Midway, watched them groan, twirling light into blur, the Ferris wheel's last passengers pointing out from their seats to town's end. These monuments that have risen between the hills to be forgotten as the lights go out. Where was she in this hazy night, maybe half-lit and Red Oak Bar, leaning on a man wedged between his thighs? I wonder what it is to dream of autumn, balled up on a park bench, the tilt-a-whirl in my gaze, wanting a passing car to take me to her. Among these monuments, I am too small to find my way to the sandbanks where sometimes she takes a man, where sometimes I wander skipping stones while she earns in the back seat of a car or under a gun rack. It is hours like these you learn the path of a ditch, a quiet only the Huffers know. Day breaks. The carnies have loaded up the rides, heading out of town in a convoy, leaving nothing behind, not even the grass. And so these newer poems are that I'll read. These next two sort of more deal with more sort of a Native American contemporary identity stuff, language-driven type of work. Not so obviously tragic. Engine. Blood navigation. Genome scribe. Cause for melanin. Skin dust. Clown in the night clacking flint. The order of which ceremony is encoded with science. Plumage cranium. A romance of bells. breastplate of cut glass beads, swaying yarn shadowing against the slick down grass. A teleportation from one history to the next, wearing our best whittled face, rendered in silver nitrate. Coral scaled serpents, obsidian flayed skins, twined flesh, rust tasting blood, maggot in the ear. Hopi, Indonesia, sacred beer gut, ventriloquized murmur of tooth and plier. We are past tense, speaking in accentuated vowels, howling gospel in a nexus of sticks and stretched skins. Half-life. Morning is sun yellow and splintered wood paneling. A clock. Brass hands blistering rust. Old beans in the pot. Bears tinge of coveralls. Boots caked in machine grease. A mold of modern man glowing in grime like a gear. On the table, rattlesnake beans, cornbread, mustard, yellowing the mash, salt meat melted into the juice, rations, can-shaped meat sliced, fried in bacon grease. The language of galvanized nail, minnows shine, a death by naming, half-life, vanishing point. The tongue of science wants the brown hand to wield a wrench, to know wheel and lug nuts, grip of metal. Erasure, tongue is a piston, the body sun-cooked. From where I'm from, trailer houses sit on flattened rubber tires. Well pump, gurgle in the tin, steel between the teeth, the road pulverized to dust, rocks snapping. And so I'll just read one more. This is sort of a more sublime poem, and it's dedicated to my son, Karis, who is now 13. I feel like an old man when I say that. And this is actually one of the first poems that I actually wrote about Syracuse, which is not a place that I would think that poetic material would come from, but I've been there so long I had to transform it and mold it somehow, so this is what came about. And it's about snow, obviously. Syracuse has lots of snow. Sun perch. It is late, but outside the night is glowing with snow and street light. Quiet, but for the occasional growl and skid of the plows. Winter, Syracuse, where the fainting snow fusses and scatters until it collapses roofs and power lines. And now, sitting in that gauzy light, nothing but the sounds of sleep, my son's cub-like snore. I am reminded that most of my childhood was spent walking in another city, alone. A boy who knew nothing of evenings, only by the gradual blackening behind buildings, electric poles humming like insects, from the street curb hearing the clink of dishes, chuckles of supper. I remember a fish staring blankly at me from the center of a round plate rimmed with almond-eyed bluebirds, wings extended, mid-flap, the fish perhaps lightly steamed, then wok-fried, charred along the belly, fins crisped, mouth open from its last breath, fossilized in a reduction of fish sauce and honey. Next to the plate, a bowl of steamed rice. I sat at the table waiting, not knowing how to eat the fish or rice with chopsticks, smiling as best I could while in Vietnamese John explained to his parents how I lived 3 blocks away and that I'd been home alone for days. His father looked at me as he left the kitchen wearing the shirt of a machinist, Paul stitched above the right pocket. Later, I would learn he worked 3 jobs, and on his only day off, Sunday, after Mass, he would drive his family to some faraway lake outside the city where they would reel in sun perch and net them boatside. As I sat at the table, the smells of cooking oil and aromatics faded. John translated for his mother, who asked me to spend the night, and I said, "No, thank you," smiled, and walked home to whatever misfortune awaited in that dark house where the plumbing was empty, my bed a pallet of blankets on the living room floor. I said no, not out of shame, but because I wanted to lie down and remember how I'd used my fingers to scrape flesh off bones, skin tearing with it, and how I trembled when I was asked to eat the eyes, fins, and tail. I remember now how my wife once looked at me in the throes of labor, how she gripped my hand when the pain ruptured up, and how, through it all, behind the brown webbing of her pupils, there was gentleness. When our son finally came, he could not breathe. He was blue, motionless. I remember the midwife rushing him off, and minutes later hearing a gasping bawl. I didn't know what I saw as my son shivered, hands gnarled, locked in cry, still blind from birth, breathing underneath a plastic dome. When I think of it now, the drive to that faraway lake, my first catch flopping in the boat, and later jerking the hook from its mouth, the sun perch must have been surprised at the sudden uselessness of its gills, and as I watched it gasp helplessly against the hull of the boat, I wished what all boys wished for, a way of remembering how air rushes from your body after being socked in the gut, to sit in the dark, alone, when street light is just enough for a boy to make shapes with his hands, a play made of light, light made of snow. Thank you.
So to start, I was struck with this phrase in your reading, Santee, the first poem you read, Root Juice. You said, "this ancient thing in plastic." Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that in relation to both of your poems. I feel that there's really, the voice in the poems is often, I think, sort of tethered by its own history, and how that history manifests itself in our present and in the work now. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to history in your work and how you find that it comes through in your writing. And that could be your own history or American history at large, really.
Okay. Well, growing up, for the first 5 years of my life, I spoke nothing but the Cherokee language. My family were fluent speakers, and also involved in methods of healing and medicine that are ancient, in terms of the Americas, using roots, snake root. I think I mentioned blood root. All of these things as a part of those medicines, not only for just physically healing properties, but also for, like you say, if you have someone you desire and you want them to fall in love with you, and you can visit a person and they'll do some sort of, magic and say, do this while you're in the presence of that person, and they'll fall in love with you, that type of thing. And so what I was trying to do is approach that element of my culture without saying what I just told you, without sort of exoticizing it in a way. I wanted to make that kind of experience accessible, and especially in Dark 30, there's another poem called Gunshot Conjure, which is about a grandfather figure who seeks out this type of medicine in order to stop being so abusive to his family. And so, which does happen where I'm from. And so I was always interested in that, but I didn't want to sort of layer in a political signifiers associated with my history, right? I wanted to make that sense of culture accessible to everyone. And that's kind of why the ancient thing in plastic, it's kind of this and when you would see it, there would be a complete whole root grown inside of this, in this 2-liter, and it would make something so ugly as a Coke 2-liter bottle beautiful, right? They would take the wrapper off, and it would be this sort of, gnarling thing there, right? And obviously you would drink the juice to get that medicine or those nutrients, and so that's kind of how that came about.
I would probably say that I don't want to be a contrarian, like that kind of thing, but I would say that when I think about my relationship to history in my work, it's probably going in the opposite direction, in the sense that I want my work to send people out to find the history that they don't have, to give in the poems enough of a reason to want to know, to do that work. But that said, we think we know a lot more about African American history than we do about some other histories, and so what I'm glad about is that both of those impulses can be followed, and in fact I do follow both of those impulses at times. But I think that my own sense, especially in the New Black, was really bound up in how weighted the present is with the past, that even when I thought I wasn't writing poems about how the past is informing the present, I was, because it always is. And each poem taught me that again.
Yeah, I can feel that weight. I like the way that you have put that, how weighted the present is with the past. I do feel that in your work, and I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. So you both kind of brought up issues of accessibility, and you mentioned that you are wary of exoticizing your identity. And I'm thinking about that in terms, I think that a trap that we fall into a lot in conversations like these, and that moderators like myself can fall into, is to, maybe it's inevitable, but to ask questions about cultural identity, and how, you feel that you express your particular cultural identity through your work. And I think the thing about a question like that is it implies that there is a universal identity that exists in poetry or in literature, and a universal tradition to write out of, or a point of view to write out of, and that you're apart from that. So I want to know what you think, how you feel about your relationship to what is, maybe there isn't a universal identity or point of view, but maybe there's a dominant one. And how do you feel that your own writing intersects with that kind of dominant view? How does it diverge from it? And what's your relationship to that idea?
I like that question, but not because I don't like being asked about how my cultural identity informs my work. I think that question just should be asked of everyone. Right?
Yeah, that's what it is. It's not.
Right. But the idea that there's a dominant culture that that my work is in, or in relation to, and yet not wholly subsumed by, that resonates as well. I feel in some ways like what African American poetry or literature is described really well by Baraka when he talks about African American music and blues people. The idea that the blues was a form that could only have been invented by people with an African past and an American reality. That, the blues didn't come from Africa, and they didn't just, grow in America untethered, unrelated to that past that people brought over with them on ships. So for me, African American poetry, which is the tradition that sort of first informs my work, is always already interested in, engaged with, borrowing from, mixing on, messing with the dominant tradition of American poetry, and I continue that sort of process very actively because there's a lot of American poetry that I love.
Right.
Well, coming from a sovereign native nation, right? We're constantly reminded that there is a dominant culture, and if we don't behave properly as native nations, as First Nations, as indigenous people, things like funding and things like certain federal government support, things like that, will be taken away from us. And I think that there are a lot of native poets that are dealing with those types of politics in their work, and I appreciate all the work that they're doing. That cultural work, I think, is really important. And for me, and the way that I identify for my nativeness, and I do feel that I do sort of project a sort of native voice in my work. The reason why I choose not to use certain political signifiers in terms of how I identify myself as a native person. If I say the word indigenous, obviously that's encoded with a lot of political meaning, right? If I say that I'm Cherokee, that's still not even quite right, because in another native language that means the enemy, right? And so, but we carry the name because it's been given to us, right? And so there's all of these names and identifiers that have been given to native people throughout history. And in some ways, in order to control, or to me, to produce an authentic Native American experience in my work, I forced myself not to use those things in my poems, just because I felt like my experiences, right, in some ways should be free of those politics, and in that is some way a form of protest, right? And I think that, from the 1970s and looking at the Red Power movement and its effect on poetics, right, which is the American Indian movement and the sort of awareness of Native people to produce and to protest the dominant culture, right? I think we have a lot of interesting poetries today that are resisting that dominant culture in a very obvious and direct way, and I think that's something that we need. But that's a choice that I couldn't make in my own work.
Another question along those lines. When they're talking about the expectations placed on a conversation like this, and that you're going to be the poets to respond to a question of identity. Do you feel that there's an imperative for you to write back to these questions of race in America? And do you feel that there should be an imperative for every poet to engage in these? Do you wish that more poets who aren't going to be invited to a panel like this with poets of color would be engaging in these issues?
I have almost nothing to say about what all poets should do.
Right. Well,
right? I mean, are all poets of color, or
right.
That like that idea of a particular mandate that's supposed to apply to everyone is one of the things that has gotten in the way of some really productive other things,
right,
that happen around cultural work that mobilizes around race, right? I'm thinking about the Black Arts Movement and that kind of thing. But so and I know you know that, but I myself don't so much feel a responsibility, but a real desire to write back to those kinds of questions. I feel like these issues are so complicated that the more people are putting their minds to them, thinking about them actively, not pretending like not talking about them is making them go away. Colorblind era, you hear me? Post-race, you hear me? The more that people are engaged with questions of particularly race and ethnicity, or actually not particularly, but all the kinds of identities that that various ones of us are attached to, enjoy, and also have to organize around for our own survival, the better. I think keeping those conversations alive is one of the things that I want to do in my poetry.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I do feel as a member of a Native nation a responsibility as if I'm doing cultural work, even though I'm not using a specific set of language in my poems. But, you know, no matter what I do, and because of the politics and the world that we live in, I'll always be known as a Cherokee poet first, right, rather than a poet. And so I think I do make I do make use of that in my own poetry. And for me, I think with especially the two language-driven poems that I read tonight, that's really the first time that I started dealing with identity, right, and what it means to be a Native or Indigenous person in this country, and how we continue to survive, Western imperialism and colonialism, right? Because the Native, Natives are not post-colonial, right? We are still living underneath a dominant culture, and we're still having to navigate that. And I think that in some ways, and it's going to sound probably the stupidest thing ever, but in some ways, by not directly fighting it, I think in some ways doesn't give it the same amount of power that it would have. Which isn't to say that in my work I don't do this, but as a member of the Cherokee Nation, right, and being my wife is of the Onondaga Nation, I married a Native woman. We were married in the Longhouse traditionally, which there is no divorce, right? We go to ceremonies all the time. My kids go to, a reservation school where they're learning culture and those types of things every day. I do think that I'm doing a cultural work. But that's not the visible part of, obviously my identity, and so it's a tricky thing. I think some like Simon Ortiz, writers like Simon Ortiz, believe that you should be protesting and that you should be promoting Native American nationalism in your work, and I certainly appreciate that. He's done a lot for Native American poetics, but I don't think that has to be everyone's fight per se.
So Eevee, you had the phrase in one of your poems, the poem I need, and that you were writing that poem at that moment. I wonder what it is that you feel you need from a poem. Do you find that you are often writing the poem that you wish existed in the world? And what kind of work do you, are you hoping to fill that need for others? What kind of work do you hope those poems are doing?
That's a great question. Sometimes I think if there's a poem that I'm anticipating a need for or thinking I need, that is the poem I'm writing or going to write. But I often find poems that I only know I needed once I've read them, right? You read them and something opens up or lifts off or unleashes, and I don't always know that I'm looking for that poem until I've stumbled onto it. But yeah, I think when I'm conscious of an absence or a gap or a desire for a particular kind of poem to exist, then I take it upon myself to make a stab at it. And I do like to think of myself as being enough like enough people in some way that there's going to be someone else out there who might not know that they needed that poem, but when they find it, will then have that same experience of, oh, something opening or moving.
I'm a very cranky poet. I'm never writing the poem that I want to be writing. I'm always writing the one that I have to write, and I have notebooks full of these poems that I wish that I could do. I had this sort of fascination with racetracks that you see sort of in rural America, and I wanted to write poems about that. I wanted to write about all of these other things, but it seems like for me, I'm never able to access those things directly. It's always the poem comes and finds me, and I feel that I'm a conduit, right, of that energy, and that's what ends up on the page. And I use my tools, my technique, and my knowledge of poetry to translate that somehow to sort of sculpt out a poem. And I'm constantly wrestling with that. I always wanted to write sort of these philosophical, language-driven, experimental poems, but then all of these narrative poems came out of me, and and it's not to say that the process itself wasn't gratifying. It was, but when I first began that type of work, it just didn't feel like that's what I wanted to do. But it wasn't until after I finished it when I realized that's exactly what I needed to do as a writer. That's exactly the process that I needed to go through in order to move beyond certain elements of technique, and then also my own past, my own personal story as well.
So I'm going to shift a little bit. I've been thinking a lot about lately about this idea of literary citizenship that's been floating around in the ether. And there was an article written recently kind of railing against this idea. And the author interpreted the idea of literary citizenship. This is in Salon, by the way, salon.com, if you want to look at it. But the author was interpreting the idea as essentially that we as writers are expected now to not only write the work, but really go out there and push the work and sell the work. But I don't know if I would necessarily see it that way, because what I think of when I think of a citizen, I think of a community. And I think there's a lot more that can offer. So I'm just curious about your idea of that concept, and about what community can do for a poet, what the role of community is for you in your work, how you relate to that.
I was Googling literary citizenship before the reading. She was mentioning it. So I have a kind of a very sort of remedial understanding of what that is. But what I will say, and speaking to community, and currently I think this is a really exciting time for Native American poetry. It's as diverse as it's ever been. There's a range of voices out there. Sherwin Bitsui, who was supposed to be here tonight, and I regret that you're missing hearing him read. He's a wonderful reader. Is doing some interesting things in terms of an image-driven. He would get on to me for saying surreal, but surrealist type of poetry. And then you see someone like Orlando White doing a sort of who is Navajo, also doing a language sort of fragmented, experimental type of poetry. And you see Joan Kane doing this really sort of interesting cultural work and language revitalization, and Natalie Diaz doing sort of probably one of the most widely read Native American poets in the last probably 15 years. You see all of that diversity, and I think it's so. And in a lot of in another era that would have divided us, I think, right, because of style and genre. But these days, because of our kinship as Native people, it really binds us together, right? And it really does sort of give us a place or a footing in the poetry world that I think is really important. We're all providing a sort of an indigenous perspective, and I always like to say an original perspective, on American poetry and on the American experience. And I think, in terms of that, I think it's a very important. And if that speaks to literary citizenship in some ways, it's very important for us to promote those voices and to promote those experiences.
So I had not stumbled onto this concept. Have been in a sort of semi-blissful retreat from the web for a few months. If only email could go with that, but and I did not Google, just to be clear. So I'm really responding more to the question about community than literary citizenship. I mean, or to the idea that, to the extent that literary citizenship has something to do with market, right? Mm-hmm. Market and community are they can be related, but I think community is so much more than market, and the word market is so instantly instrumentalizing that I always feel more comfortable talking about community and audience, mm-hmm. right? Whether or not anyone is buying my poetry, and of course, my publishers, probably have a different set of things to say. But whether or not anyone is buying the poetry, what matters to me is that people are reading or listening to or engaging with the poetry. And when I think about community and its relationship to audience, it's the poetry community that you grow up in, that nurtures you, that helps you become the poet, or keep becoming the poet that you want to be. That's your first audience. I've been a part of a number of essential poetry communities, of which Cave Canem is, if not at the top of the list, on that pyramid of the winner's circle pyramid, right? I can't imagine being a poet without having been in Cave Canem. There were also poetry groups that have no name, and were the 3 or 4 people that I met with in my, in our apartments in grad school, without which I would not be the poet that I am. But those communities help you become, and from there it becomes a matter of concentric circles where you're feeding someone's poetry. The people who I read because they fed me and because I was learning from them. And whether you're learning as a poet or learning about life, the world that you live in, I think of it at its best, community and audience are both kind of feedback loops, where there's giving and getting, going not unidirectionally, but back and forth. And that's what I'm looking for when I think about either of those terms.
Thank you for that response. You both had a lot to say, even though you had not read that article. But I mean, I'm really more interested in the idea of community than the idea of market. And, I think that's a really astute observation, and I think that's one of the reasons why I was like, well, why are you so upset about this? I like people and talking about writing with them. But I'm thinking again about other things I have read online. I am not unplugged from the internet. And I was reading an article last week, or last month, by Simone White, and she spoke about, she's another Cave Canem fellow and is amazing, check out her work. She spoke about her frustration with what she saw as a very segregated poetry community in New York. And I wonder if you observe a segregation in your own communities of poetry, and how you respond to that, if you do observe it, and do you hope to expand that, to blow that up, to straddle those lines? What's your observation in your own experience?
I'll tackle that. With natives, I think there are so few of us, we have no choice but to band together all the time. We represent 0.02% of the population. And so in that regard, I think that there is no sort of segregation in terms of, amongst native people. Obviously, there are, numerous cultures that we're all affiliated with, but in terms of when we come to the written word, things like that, we try to support one another, from what I observe. But I think that with organizations like Cave Canem, a la this panel, right, that, when we begin sort of doing cross-cultural exchanges and things like that, we make these experiences more profound, right? And we make, in some ways, if we're looking at, the hierarchy that exists in poetry, and what is considered good poetry and bad poetry, I think a lot of the times those are often what is considered good and bad is often on sort of relegated on the lines of race, right? A lot of the times, well, if this poetry deals with race, if this poetry deals with culture in some ways, that somehow it's inferior to a poetic expression that doesn't deal with any of those things, that deals more with concept and philosophy and things like that. But I think as more and more sort of minority communities get involved in these things, I think that what is considered to be good poetry or effective poetry, whatever, I think that will slowly sort of change in some ways. But I didn't really answer your question, but I just kind of rambled on. But that's
I think that's such an interesting question, because I haven't heard that said. I've heard that said about other cities than New York, and I'd be interested to know if that's the experience of people here. But I mean, there are two ways I could think about answering that question. One is that when you are writing, you need two things. You need a little bit of risk and a little bit of safety. And sometimes those things don't come in the same place or in the same group, right? And so you have to be able to go and get your safety, and then you have to be able to go out, you might say, and risk some things. Sometimes you're risking and safe at the same time, but that's probably the best of all possible worlds. But I like that New York has a number of organizations, like locally based, that provide places for me to go when I know that I'm looking for a specific kind of thing. I've had, the good fortune to go to like Asian American Writers Workshop events, Kundiman events, that kind of thing, and have been introduced to some amazing work. The flip side of all of this is that I'm still so often the only person of color, or one of two or three in a room at anything, that I forget to notice that the segregation may be happening in in the sense of the dominant society still being much less inclusive, or even when that's not about intent, I'll say it like that, that sometimes those spaces are not excluding people, they're just not inviting to people who have different investments than I do.
Right.
So yeah, that's not an answer, that's just I hadn't been thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up that idea of risk and safety and how necessary both of those things are. I wonder, and I'm kind of forming this question, so bear with me, but I wonder, you're talking about how you have this experience often of being the only person of color in a room. Do you feel that there's maybe kind of more inherent risk, perhaps that a writer of color who is operating in this world where there is a dominant society inherently just has more risk in their day-to-day existence as a poet, because they're always kind of entering as an other into that room? Are you kind of forced to risk more in that way, in a way that maybe perhaps a member of that dominant culture wouldn't have to in their day-to-day existence as a writer?
Can you rephrase that? For a long time, doing my MFA at Syracuse, I was the only person of color in the room, and my poems were constantly sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't say that the deconstructed would be a nice way to put it, but a lot of the times I felt that I did have to deal with I always feel like I have to deal with indigenous survival in my work. Whether or not that I encode those languages in there, that's another thing, but I feel that every single one of my poems deals with indigenous survival in some way, shape, or form. And I would constantly, either in that workshop, either they would totally sort of dismiss that type of expression, or they would in a sense try to I guess, patronize me in some ways, right? And as a native, right, well, you're so pitiful and all of these other things, and it must have been so hard growing up this way and things like that, right? They're not really looking at the technique. They're not really looking at the poem as a construction, right, as a work of art, right? They're looking at all of these other things that are coming into the poem as a way to, and somehow, and I feel that patronizing is also in a way demeaning, right, and dismissing also, and I feel that a lot, you know, in terms of trying to explain my experience and explain what my poetry is about, things like that, to a person, a non-native, I guess I would say, is very difficult. A lot of the times they see just the graphic, they see just the sort of the obvious things that I place in my work, and they don't see any subtlety. And I think that's a lot of the times what I experience in terms of how a non-person of color experiences my work. They don't see any of the subtlety, they don't see any of the technique, they don't see any of the time and the artistry that I try to put into my poems, and I think that's a shame.
I've almost forgotten what the question was at this point.
I don't think I answered it right.
No,
That's right.
you said a lot of important things. I mean, it was about risk. Yeah. One of the things that a friend of mine said to me when we were in school, this was law school for whatever it's worth, but like law school, poetry is a lot of work, and she said it takes a lot of energy to be black, and what that meant was there are inevitably, for at least those of us who grew up, you know, prior to the turn of the century. I will not speak for this current generation, maybe, but for anyone who grew up before the turn of the century, if you had been made aware that you were black by your family, by your enemies, by, you know, kids at school or whoever, then you will just spend time. You will spend time dealing with that, dealing with the way you think about that, the way you think people are thinking about that. And one way that I often think about one way to think about white privilege is it's the privilege of not having to think about that. To not even be aware that you're not having to think about that, to not have to decide not to think about that, right? So I'm talking about energy and time, which is not quite the same thing as risk, but I think that poets of color are often thinking about how whatever it is they want to do is going to be received. Is this going to be black enough or Indian enough, or is this going to be too political, too controversial? If I add any other factor of my identity into the mix, am I going to, you know, alienate people who I need, whose support I need, vice versa? It's I think a very conscious process, and how anyone deals with it is as unpredictable as, you know, the number of different ones of us there are. We all make our own decisions about how to deal with that, shaped by the environments we find ourselves in. But I do think in that way, there's more risk to living as a person of color than otherwise, or you're conscious of it.
Thank you both for those really thoughtful responses as I blundered through that question. So I wanted, you brought up technique, so let's shift and talk a bit about that. You know, I looking at both of your books, I've seen a lot of different shapes coming through in your poems. How do you decide how the poem's going to take place on the page shape-wise? And I also, you know, I'm also wondering about how that relates to sound for you, and what your relationship is to those two things and how they relate to each other.
My first poetry teacher was Arthur Z. I'm sure most all of you are probably familiar with his work, Chinese American poet. And one of his first lessons when I went into his workshop was he taught us to look at the page not as a piece of paper, obviously, but how a Chinese calligrapher would look at the page, right? And so there's the page itself, and then there is all this space around the page, right? And you have to think not only about what ends up being on that, right, what the words and the language, but you also have to think about how you enter it and how you exit it, and what things are fueling the poems indirectly, right, that are ultimately going to be left out of the poem. And so that's that sort of space outside of the page. And so I still kind of look at my poetry that way. Whenever a poem comes to me, a lot of the times I'll say, well, after a few lines, I say, well, this poem seems to be about another childhood memory, something like that. And then I start thinking about all of the things that are in my childhood memory that I can't place into the poem, that exist in that indirect space, and what does the reader need in order to understand and sort of come along with me on this experience. And so that's sort of the first part of that, of my process. And then as I go through, I start to begin to hear, music, because I read the poem out loud as I'm writing, and so I'm start thinking about sounds. And so a lot of the times with a lot of the free verse poems that I write, how I try to use the white space is to accentuate certain sounds that I'm making, or to feature or emphasize certain language, right? And so I'll drop a line, or I'll put it in the space in the space in a certain way. But sometimes, and this happened to me when I was writing a lot of sonnets, immediately the music would just sound like a sonnet, and so I would place it into that form. And I think with the sort of the classical forms, I get it really lucky, heroic couplet, that type of thing, that the poem almost immediately functions within that form. And so a lot of the times I'm making those choices as I'm coming to the page. But a lot in terms of the free verse, I look at it more as a chipping away, a stripping down of language, right? What does the reader need, and what is too much a lot of the times? And so I try to strip away as much as I possibly can. And as you could tell with some of the more language-driven poems that I read in the middle of the reading, right, that is extremely, that language has been stripped of a lot of other sounds that I felt like weren't needed to sort of get that expression across to the reader, as compared to a more pastoral sort of narrative type of poetry. It needs those sort of in-between sounds of the and a and all of those things to kind of get its music across.
I talk about form a lot, so forgive me if any of you have heard some of this before, but I love that idea of calligraphy, that sense of space. I tend to think of the page as, as a canvas. That's not new, and that the poem, unless there is a sort of a given form, a traditional form that is about syllables or meter or line lengths and that kind of thing, about couplets and stanzas. If there's not some kind of a traditional form that I'm working with, I want to use the space of the page to make the meaning of the poem clearer, right? So a poem like X Marks the Spot, which is in my book, it literally, the words form an X. I mean, it makes that idea instantly much more material, less abstract, and I hope pushes your response to the language itself to a different level almost immediately. And in a sense, that's kind of the same way that I use music. Sometimes I'm using music very literally, not just like the music of language that we talk about, but songs, lyrics. And if I'm referencing a song or inviting you as the reader to sort of sing it in your head as you're going through the poem, it's because I know, or at least I hope, that all of you are the kind of people who, when you hear a song, you have a particular emotional reaction to it. You remember, where you were when you first heard it, and it's going to take you to a particular place. And there are songs that I'll reference that kind of have a cultural a cultural collective response embedded in them, I think. So if you hear strange fruit, you're instantly in a particular place, for example. So I'm using, I think, sound and shape as shortcuts or, pillars to put the poem and or the reader right where I need them to be, or the poem needs them to be.
So that all sounds very intentional. I mean, it sounds like you really have a vision of where you're going. Do you find, for both of you, do you find that when you begin, do you kind of know where you're going to end up, or does the work kind of take over and take you someplace you don't expect?
I can say just quickly about the poem that I wrote on the train, quite literally. I gave myself that challenge, and I said it has to be a sonnet, because a sonnet is something that has it has a clear beginning and a clear end. I know formally where it has to go, and I won't get stuck because the rhyme will sort of push or pull me to to the end of a line, and so if I know where the form is taking me, I don't have to know where the subject is going, and that's what actually happened with that poem. It's like, I'm writing about the urgency of writing, not about needing a new poem because I'm going to be sharing old
so
work.
That constriction actually allows you freedom in a way.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What for you?
Yeah, I always, for me, writing a poem, I never hardly ever know where I'm going or where anything is going to take me. I feel like I'm hitchhiking half the time. I'll come through, I'll go through 3 months of long silences, and there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety associated with that type of process, and then I'll sort of go on a binge where I'll produce a poem or 3 poems in a week, which I feel is very, very lucky. And a lot of the times I don't really take the time to understand what I'm doing in those spaces. I don't reflect on them. A lot of the times, months after I had written a poem, I'll go back and investigate and try to understand how I can revise in order to bring out what the poem is trying to communicate to the reader. A lot of the times, and then sometimes I'll get lucky and I'll write a poem and just in one day. That poem, Mama's Work, actually came to me in one sitting, and I think after that there was only one word that I ever changed out of that, and it was sprayed to splayed, right, the hair at the end, and that was Terrence Hayes's influence. He said, I think you got to change one word, and that's sprayed, and then I changed it, but it was kind of, that was his influence. I was taking a workshop with him at that time, and we were supposed to write a poem about childhood, and what that poem did, though, when I wrote that in one sitting, it unlocked all of these other memories that seemed to be floating around in my poetic process, and then I was able to sort of navigate that more effectively because I had strands and themes to deal with. And so at that point, I just had to trust myself as a poet, and that I had read enough and that I have researched enough technique and theory to sort of execute them properly. And so, what is that saying? They're all drafts until you die. I'm still looking at all of my mistakes and thinking that if I ever have the chance to go back and revise them, I'll certainly do that.
So along those lines, when you're writing a book of poetry, which you both have done that, are you thinking about the book as you write poems? One poet I asked this question. He said it was a container. He thought of the book as a container, and he visualized that container and would just fill that container with poems. Do you have that relationship to the book? And how do you know, for you, what makes a collection of poetry feel like a book?
It's a tough question. I think, like, for me, there's a certain sense of gratification or feeling after I completed a poem that I feel like that I'm in book territory, where I can, there is enough encoded in the poem or hidden in the poem that I can bring it out and I can produce enough material that binds it together. And then there are other times where I feel like I'm just writing to explore style, that I'm writing to explore form and those types of things, and I don't feel like I'm writing a book. In that, I guess, if we think about postmodernism, I guess if we could do a mashup, that might work. But for the most part, I really there's a certain set of themes and strands that I feel that I come across in my writing, and those ultimately, I think within Dark 30 especially, I always feel that they belong to a book-length experience a lot of the times, and so it's really difficult because most of the time I feel like most of the poems that I write, about 90% of them do not feel like they belong to a larger experience, right? Maybe 10% of a work that I'll do an entire year feels like it belongs in a book, and just because that's how my mind works, it's just so disjunctive a lot of the times, and so again, a source of a lot of anxiety for me.
Yeah, I was going to say that is such a fraught question. So if anyone out there is facing a challenge that they feel like they don't know if they have a book or how it's coming to, welcome. Join me. We can light candles together. I have not. Okay, so I'm in two places. I have not ever written a project book that, like, in terms of what's published. Neither Half Red Sea or The New Black are books that I thought I am going to write a book about, and then I just set forth and did that. I just write poems. I was just writing poems, and at a certain point, with the first book, I tried a gazillion different forms of manuscript, and finally got to know what was connecting certain poems enough to pull it into a shape that stuck, that felt right. The second book, The New Black, I had been writing a book, but I didn't know I had been writing a book. There were lots of poems that I was writing that didn't come into this, but there was this steady thread of things. I was really asking myself questions about, why do I understand race so much differently than my students, or somewhat differently than my mother? Those kinds of questions were, what does it all mean? How is Obama president? How is that? I don't understand. That book was being written. Now I'm working on a long poem, so by definition it's a book-length long poem, so by definition it's a book.
So problem solved there, right?
Oh, if only. Now I need a fiction writer to tell me how to make a narrative do what narratives do, but yeah, it's just continually fraught for me.
Well, I'm sure you're not alone in that. I know I feel the same way. So I want to open it up now for questions from the audience. If you have any, just shout it out, raise your hand, shout it out. Yeah?
Hi, Patrick. It's a pleasure to get to see old friends and make new friends. I wanted that you all talk a little bit about place. I think.
Well, I'm going to just start by summarizing that for those who are joining us online and are listening to a recording. The question is, how does place inform your work? And just speak a little bit about how your relationship to place in your writing.
I'll answer first because it'll be short. I write about places, but they're often not the place where I am, or my subway poem is not about moving or the subway. Like, there's a disconnect in the sense of an active informing of my process, but place, I guess I would say, if you're looking for place in my work, you're going to find who I am as a person who was raised in the South, or who I am as a person who has only lived on this side of the Mississippi, so has certain relationship to mountains and greenness and the Atlantic, and you're gonna know who I am by the places I've lived, but not in the way that I think anyone would ever call me a poet of place. Right?
I'm always I'm never in the moment. I'm always transporting myself to memories and places that, things that I try to unpack and understand experiences that I'd had from memory a lot of the time. And so place is really important in terms of how I construct a poem. A lot of the times, I have a poem called Coin Laundry, which is basically a portrait of a mother and daughter at a laundromat. And when I wrote the poem, I had to transport myself back to the same laundromat and remember as much as I could, right? As many of the objects, the color, all of those things, the sound as I could in order to produce that poem again. And so a lot of the times, like I said with the Syracuse poem, I've been living there 7 years, and that's the only poem that's popped out of, that place. And so a lot of the times I do have to make that sort of transformation, or at least in some ways, in my mind, go back to those points. And for me, it's a deep sort of meditation that has to occur. So I can almost never do it while I'm traveling. I have to be in a quiet space. I have to be alone, no kids around, no wife around, like that kind of thing, and really kind of get into that moment and re-experience it. Because there is also, it's like hearing a song, right? When you hear a song from 1993, it takes you back to that emotional experience that you had, right? And so when you're trying to transport yourself back in memory, I think the same thing for the poet has to occur. You have to experience that emotional sort of complexity that you were engaged in at that particular time. And so that's how I try to, that's a part of the process. But in terms of creating place, I often try to use the names, with a lot of the rural poems in Cherokee County that I wrote about. I try to use a lot of the native names for places and things like that in order to sort of point the reader to that region and help them experience what that landscape and what the culture of that area might be like.
More questions? Yeah. So the concern that has been raised is about the idea of imagery over form, and which of those do you privilege? Do you privilege form over imagery? And just speak, I guess, a bit about those two things in your work.
I think it's pretty obvious I privilege the image, and then I kind of work the form to accentuate that. But I think that when you produce an image, right, and it moves the reader in certain ways, I think that there's a certain level of orchestration. The orchestration of sound is really important to that. And so a lot of the times, because the reader will see the graphic nature of that image, they'll miss out on how it was constructed rhythmically a lot of the times, right? And so, and this is the same kind of issue that we have with the English language. A lot of the times we're speaking in iams, right? We're speaking in a kind of music and rhythm, but we don't accentuate it that way. And so a lot of the times there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of emphasis, like with the mother figure poems that I have, on just what that means, right? And what kind of sense does it make? What am I trying to say through those images, as opposed to how were those images constructed? What are the sounds associated with that, right? And I think when you look at an established poet, maybe someone like, let's take for instance maybe Theodore Roethke, right? You take the time to look at how he put it together, right? What form is he using? What types of sounds did he use? Oh, look at that trochee, look at this trochee right here. Obviously he meant to do that. But I don't think that a lot of the times, because of the way that I produce images and I put them into the work, and because I'm a Native person, I think that those concerns aren't often addressed by some readers. I don't think that it's all readers. I don't think that it's everyone, right? I just think that there's just a certain readership that wants to see that, that wants to take it at face value, right? That this is a tragic sort of experience and not a constructed one. That.
I don't know if you wanted to speak to that. Okay. Okay, there's a couple more. Yes.
Thank you all for the great questions and everything.
So the question was, talk about the title of your second book, The New Black. Well, I'm trying to think if I've said this already before for folks in this room, but the idea is, of course, at one level drawing on the figure of speech that comes out of fashion industry, that pink is the new black, or orange, well, no, I can't do that anymore, right? Red is the new black, whatever color dress they want you to buy instead of the dress that's in your closet that's perfectly wonderful and has stood you through the test of time. And that concept of the invented need to renew the steadfast old faithful, I guess, is one of the things that motivates the title. And I was thinking about it obviously also in the sense of race and how there, in the African American tradition, there have always been these assertions of newness, the new Negro, the new black poetry, and the idea that blackness is always being revised, and it always seems to be responding to a need to get rid of the old one and to come up with a blackness that will work for whoever, right? So the new black maybe is kind of poking a little bit of not fun, fun, poking a little fun at the idea that that there's something wrong with the blackness that we've got, and also leaving a space for the idea that there is something going on that is not what we've always had.
Okay, there's one more question right here in the right.
Dr. Shockley, you know this about me already. I had quite a romp through Renegade Poetics and the New Black. You might work with Santee obviously is familiar with True. I don't want to try to make this too wide-ranging a question. In my dialogue with Santee about Renegade Poetics, we had a lot of discussion about how the book was a clarion call for black poetry and black literature in general to abandon the need for service literature and sort of read service literature well at the service entrance and come through the front door with things that give a different look. And I think that you did an excellent job in the book. Poets that you presented foreground things like the ecology or form or science fiction, in place of the things we traditionally associate with black literature. And you just want to can you talk something about that the whole service literature thing, all the way?
First of all, thank you. I mean, that's just the check's in the mail. Very, very nice things for you to say. I guess to my first response is actually to the idea of service literature, that's not my term. Yeah, okay. And she and I were just talking the other day. She's such an amazing poet whose work, I think, also moves outside of expectations in the ways that I was trying to point to. What I wanted the book to do, Renegade Poetics, was to actually really just exactly some of the things that Santee's been saying, was to give people a kind of a roadmap for thinking about black formal aesthetics, black innovative writing that would open up both how it is still engaged with racial politics, even though it's not doing it in the ways that we're most traditionally familiar with, and how unwedded to any particular set of expectations that we might have for it, this poetry can be. And that said, I think I just would sort of want to close by saying that there's something, I don't know exactly how Araceli's came up with that term, but there's something about service that feels dismissive, and I'm not in writing Renegade Poetics being dismissive of the traditional or the expected. I'm just trying to open the lens a little bit. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to close us off with one more question about the future and the present, which I feel like is a hopeful way to end. So I just wonder, is there anything about poetry's current landscape that excites you, and what do you hope for in the future of poetry? Are there any kind of dreams you have for where we're going?
What I hope is for not a month to go by without my reading a poem that, the old saying, blows the top of my head off. I just want to keep stumbling into new poems by poets I love, or work by poets who I'm not familiar with, that just changes the world for me irrevocably. That's my hope, and I have reason to hope that I will be able to live that dream.
I guess about, maybe it's almost 10 years ago now, I read an edition of Callaloo that included Van Jordan, Terrence Hayes, Natasha Trethewey, and some other writers. And I remember being really moved by those poetries because I felt that they were writing experiences, something that I was familiar with, something that I could relate to, that I didn't experience in, say, the work of Wallace Stevens, who I love, but I just didn't recognize those experiences there. And a lot of the the sort of American schools of poetry, I love those poems, but again, I don't see myself. I don't see a reflection of me in those. And in that edition of Callaloo, I really thought that, and especially looking at Major Jackson and in the first poem in there was a poem called Selling Out, and when I read that poem, I felt like this guy is writing a poem about people in a check cashing line, right, that are working minimum wage and things like that, and I felt like, well, that's a type of experience that's needed in contemporary poetry, right? And so that really inspired me to write poems from my own history and from my own experiences and things like that. And what I would hope is that in the future that contemporary American poetry continues to invite those experiences, and it continues to invite those types of poetries and include them, and in some ways see them as equal, right, as someone like Wallace Stevens, as someone like Ashbery, those types of things, to be held up in that regard.
Well, I want to say thank you to our poets so much for sharing your work and your ideas with us tonight. It's been great, so I just want to give you one more round of applause.